Pues
Good morning, good afternoon. This is the last time that I say this because this is the last session in this doctoral seminar. We have the last presentation that will be carried out by Estefania Cabello. In this doctoral seminar of the Charles V European Award, devoted to the topic of cultural heritage, history, and memory for the promotion of European values, integration, and peace. Estefania will tell us about her topic, that is the reconstruction of the canon, women writers, and the 19th century press. It's going to be introduced by Carmen. It's going to be presented by Carmen FERNÁNDEZ-DAZA, who has a PhD in philology, tenured professor at Santa Ana University Center, which is ascribed to the University of Extremadura, and currently its general director. She is full academician of the Royal Academy of Letters and Arts of Extremadura and is the treasurer of the institution. She was the president of the Unión Bibliófilos Extremeños from 2004 to 2011. She is currently a member of the Board of Trustees of the Muñoz Torrero Foundation. In her research career, some translations of Latin and Greek authors like Epicurus, Seneca, or Cicero, as well as studies and monographs on characters of the Spanish Golden Age, especially Juan Antonio Veras de Zúñiga, author of the famous treatise on diplomacy, El Embajador. It's a great honor to have Carmen FERNÁNDEZ-DAZA, as she was here in our summer course devoted to diplomacy in the times of Charles V. Her intervention has been recorded and it's in our YouTube channel, and I invite you to take a look at it because it's a very rich presentation and we learned very much about the diplomatic period and the figure of ambassadors. We hadn't met personally, we had met virtually, and for me it's a great pleasure to have shared these days with her, and she's now part of the Yuste family. Professor, the floor is all yours.
Buenas tardes. Muchísimas.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for these not deserved kind words. I want to start by thanking the organizers of this doctoral seminar in this 2023 edition. Thanks for inviting me to be here as a member of this panel of professors and experts. It's for me a great honor to be chairing this panel. I'm really excited about this panel, as you can understand, and it's a panel that it's the closure of this very interesting meeting, and I have learned so much from you students who are the real teachers. Thank you very much to the directors, Mrs. Teresa Freiser, and especially Mr. Juan Carlos Moreno. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for these 8 years of very intense management, of a very intense work. And as someone from Extremadura, as a Spaniard, I'm really proud of this work, and I want to pay tribute to your work. Thanks to everyone who made this doctoral seminar possible. Thanks, Mrs. Beatriz, Esperanza, Rafael, and Carlos. Thanks to all of those who are part of the activities, communications, and secretariat of the foundation. And thanks to the secretariat of this meeting, Miguel Ángel Martín Ranos. Thanks to the sound and technicians, and thanks to the interpreters. It's an honor for me to introduce Mrs. Estefania Cabello, who is in charge of disseminating her love for words and literary texts. And she's also a poet herself. She has a degree in Hispanic philology by the University of Córdoba, and she has a double extraordinary award in the Spanish literature teaching. Her master's degree project received the Maria Zambrano Award in 2020, and it was on Carolina Coronado. I have been working on Carolina Coronado since 2009, and it's also on the constructions of her first poetic publications. This was published in the illustration notebooks of illustration and romanticism, which is one of the main publications in the field, and it's published by the University of Cádiz. She received the Critics Award by her third poetry book, The Cielo Roto de Shanghai, in 2022, and on May 23rd she received the Carmen Conde Poetry Award. Her poetry focuses on women's poetry, and it was published by Torremozas. This award has been given away 30 times for 30 years. The president of the jury was Mrs. Pilar Palomo, a very outstanding figure in the Spanish literature. Her research lines, so dear to my heart, are 19th century women writers and the reception of the classical tradition in the contemporary poetry. She has done stays in universities like Bordeaux and Oxford, as well as Colegio de México. And since 2009, she has been hired by the doctorate's training. The work that she's going to defend here is part of an international doctoral thesis that is still to be read. What's important is what she is going to tell us, and not my boring words. So before giving her the floor, I want to pay tribute to everyone who, since the world of bibliophilia, tried to create an index of Spanish women's writers. The Pérez de Guzmán brothers from Jerez de los Caballeros, and the Marquis of Jerez de los Caballeros, Manuel Serrano de San, who received the National Library Award for his work on this topic. His granddaughter, Esperanza Marina Serrano, has 2,000 books written by women of the era. And Carmen Simón Palme, I want to pay tribute to her work because she carried out this bibliography when libraries were not digitalized. And those of us who have worked in newspapers for many years without the internet, we know how hard this bibliography work was before the digital era. She's going to talk about the promotion of European values, integration, and peace. The press that she has devoted so much time of research is connected, or attempts to be connected, with Europe. And shall I continue? Can you hear me?
Bueno, decía que encaja muy bien.
I was saying that her work is very much connected to the promotion of these values, because the press that she focuses on, the Spanish press, tried to imitate the cultural newspapers, that is, the newspapers devoted to or that wanted to differentiate themselves to political newspapers, and that wanted to focus on literature in a very broad sense. In 1835, the artist said so, and there was this expression to propose press for the peace. And the great newspaper that she has studied, in that newspaper, it was said that they were looking at England, but more particularly, they were looking at France, where these picturesque, so-called picturesque newspapers were published. So her work will focus on the influence or the parallel between some British and French newspapers and two large Spanish newspapers, El Semanario Pintoresco and La Ilustración, those two newspapers. The context is the liberal debate, and at that time there was a need to redefine women. So they didn't know where to frame women. They needed women because the idea of liberal education is to have illustrated women, but just so that they could educate children for the land. So the discourse was very complex because emancipation was a forbidden term, and the different publications, the publications that were led and organized by men, the idea was to write on women's matters without giving women a voice, although they did had a voice when it came to writing. They were women writers, except for El Genio by Balaguer, that wanted to achieve a midterm or a mid-ground between emancipation and submission. And then we have Ruiz de Aguilera. In the 19th century, there was this debate on where to frame women, and that's what Estefania has worked on. My dear colleague, the floor is yours. Let's see how I can do this without becoming too emotional. Dear colleagues, dear interpreters, Carla, Nadia, Rafa, Carlos, dear members of the jury, dear Carmen Fernández-Daza, that I met because I have read each and every of your works. Let's see. When I read the program and I saw you here, I realized that this is incredibly beautiful because I feel that our research, part of our research, the purpose of our research stays within us, and part of us is going to the research or is putting the research itself. So it's a continuous and ongoing reciprocity exercise. And in a way, it's as if I had known you forever, because the people that we read, our models, our role models, are known by us. We know them, although we don't know them physically. And for me, it's a great honor to be with her physically. I want to devote this presentation to three live women. The first one is Carmen Fernández-Daza, for her incredible dedication of over a decade to Carolina Coronado, who's from Extremadura. So I admire you very much. Your research will go down in history, in the history of literature. The second woman that I want to devote my presentation is Mercedes Comellas Aguirrezábal, a wonderful woman from the group of the University of Seville, who's studying Romanticism and how to dismantle the mask of the Roman hero influenced by the English and German school of thought. And the third woman is my thesis director, Nuria Capdevila Argüelles, who has a project that's called Life Letters, funded by the Santander Foundation and Cervantes Theater, to promote the letters between the women in exile in the 20s, and well, we know that those archives had been disseminated, they had been sold, lost, and together with Isabel Santa Fe, she has worked to recover the work of these female or women writers. Many people say that the 19th century is seen from literary historiography as the century of the construction of a lady. Lady. Words have a meaning. And I want to invite you to think about this fact. What is a lady? You may think about Henry James' novels, or Jane Austen's novels, or the Bronte sisters' literatures, or a lady full of bodices and frilled skirts. This model of this portrait of a lady, this lady doesn't come by herself. That lady is a representation of a genre. That woman is representing a genre in the 19th century. If she is criticized, her whole genre is criticized. And this is changing now. So it's very important for us to understand this, because in the 19th century are the main years when women were constitutionalized as writers on an equal footing to their colleagues, their male colleagues, who had been monopolizing the papers and books. But the 19th century is not so much the portrait of a lady, and it's these ladies themselves who showed that. The 19th century is the year when these ladies are, the idea of the ladies are dismantled, because they don't want no longer to be ladies. And the post-war writers bear witness to this. So this is my introduction. And I'm going to pause my introduction to refer to a very well-known portrait, that of Carolina Coronado. I didn't want to show you the picture because I want you to picture it. An exercise of ekphrasis, and this is a comment to Enrique Moradieles, who couldn't be here. We're talking about a painting that is in the Prado Museum. It was painted by Francisco de Madrazo y Kunz. Carolina Coronado, this writer from Extremadura, is posing. Imagine her, please. It's her bust that we see. She's posing in a black suit, covered, all the way covered. She's wearing a shawl, and there's a dark background. What happens? She's looking at us. She's looking at us in the eye, directly. She's proud, stern, surly, and she's aware. It's clearly obvious that she's aware of her position in history. And we can see a mother of pearl fan and her marriage ring. And there's a reason for all of this. The only element is her marriage ring. And that has a meaning. So I started with this portrait of Carolina Coronado because that was the beginning of my thesis that received the Maria Zambrano Award. I was starting my thesis, and I spent many years studying, but sometimes you get lucky. So I hit a lucky strike, and I found some unpublished archives, and I found some letters that hadn't been published. And my thesis director said, "You have to go on." I was like, oh my God, the 19th century, how am I going to write my thesis about the 19th century? And right now I'm in love with that century. That's the first part of my thesis. I'm going to the specific, to the general. What I'm presenting now, it's the end. Relationships with Europe. So I started with Carolina Coronado here in La Jarilla, in Almendralejo, where she was from. And the second part of my thesis is about Maria herself and other women's like solidarity networks with Gertrudis Gómez d'Avellaneda, and the lyrical sorority. And I want to finish talking about rethinking the canon. There's a need to review all the concepts that, and this must be said, came to us filtered by realism and through the lens of Clarín, Galdós, and all the great men writers who are the ones who are deconstructing our lens through realism. I have a question for you. And then during the debate, I would love to hear your answers. What do you remember from Romanticism in your secondary school books? What are the ideas that we get there? Vague and useless ideas. Lots of screaming, lots of emotion, and Rosalía de Castro. Rosalía de Castro is not at all the best representative of Romanticism. What do you know about the others? Do you have an idea of what Josefa Mazanaida Almau was like? She's known in America. She has been translated in anthologies, and she's not known here. But Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer, do you know him? This is just food for thought. If we're going to talk about 19th century press, I must refer to two very important concepts. And this is an exercise of humility. It was so for me. I realized how important some historic concepts are, and how this influences women in our times. These concepts are specialization and industrialization. Margarita Nelken, I was referring to her yesterday with her wonderful book, The Social Condition of Spanish Women, that was published in 1919. And the bishop in Lerida condemned this book expressly, and some teachers were using that book in 1919, and they were fired for doing so. They were never reaccepted as teachers. So that was what happened, and everything that had been done until then was despised. So Margarita Nelken, in her book that was republished in 1975, what she tells us is that middle-class women in the 19th century has a financial problem, and this calls for a solution. The financial instability is due to the industrial transformation that aggravates the situation of middle-class women that don't have any fortune and don't have an option to make a living. So what are these women going to do during this period? Something needs to be done. Let's talk about England. We have David Parker's studies in the 20th century, how the Victorians saw themselves. So it's a self-reflection study. And what he says is that the role of women around 1840, 1850 in England, her role...
Servicial secundario.
So what did women do? They were in charge of home, of bringing up their children. Some data tell us about the hard path that they had to carry out. Each right was an achievement in the role for emancipation. David Parker analyzes the press in 1840. We have the Illustrated London News, which was a newspaper that had news from the times and images. And it said that in 1857, there's a text that talks about, well, maybe women may not get a divorce, but have an easier time if the man commits adultery. In 1852, the Illustrated London News, you hear about the rights of women for the first time. It wasn't until then that we read that. Among other information that we may despise a priori, we have the following information. In 1826, in the inauguration of the Zoological Society of London and the Royal Garden, we have the inauguration of societies like the Royal Horticultural Society, or the institution of different sports events like cricket, tennis. What does this say? How is this going to influence our writers? There are different ways of socializing, and this comes hand in hand with industrialization. And there's an added factor, the expansion of the railroad. In 1851, Mrs. FERNÁNDEZ-DAZA is aware of this. Carolina Coronado has a wonderful text. It's a letter that she wrote to her friend Ángela Grassi, another writer, and she published this letter in the press, in La Ilustración. She attends the inauguration of railroad. She was the first one to be there. And that tells us about her social and economic status of Carolina Coronado. She says, Ángela, in Spain, it's easier to ride a camel than a railroad. That's what she says. And she writes a wonderful, very ironic letter to her friend that is published openly. And she says, Dear, of course I cannot go to theater with you because I was late, because the railroad broke down. And these Spaniards don't learn from the British. I was installed in the first wagon. Do they want these to break down and the wealthier of us die? She said whatever she felt like saying. She was privileged, and this has to be said. They were freer than we are right now. this text goes on saying, well, and I had to stay there waiting for another railway to come, and when it came, it was like Hernán Cortés coming to the rescue. She allows herself to say things like that. She was ironic, she was very witty, and I'm saying this to give you an idea of what we're talking about, because this was published openly in the press. In 1849, and I'm continuing to talk about these influences that she received in England. In England, the Female Migration Fund was started. This was an organization of women who wanted to migrate to the US, to Canada, and to other parts of the world. There's a news included in the Illustrated London News, and this is a quote.
In London to happiness and plenty in Australia. Entonces, venid, ellas, y de hecho se iban.
They wanted to leave, and if look up the Female Immigration Fund, you can see the list of women that boarded those boats, those ships. Some of them shipwrecked, but they left nonetheless. So what's happening at the same time culturally? All these facts talk about changes, cultural changes. Culture is perceived differently, and the way we perceive ourselves culturally is changing, and in comparison with others, because Professor Rosa was mentioning this. These women are aware that they have a role that needs to be legitimized, and they have public spaces that they have to legitimize, and they have to legitimize the model of women writers, and that's why the lyrical sorority, La Hermandad Lírica, was created. In this specific realm, that's when La Gaceta appeared, and then we have seminars, magazines, and this follows the French trend. All these cultural agitation movements come with criticism. There are some other newspapers that criticize, for example, the balls that were organized by the aristocrats, because people spent a lot of money in their costumes or what they wore. In these newspapers, there are some specific mentions. For example, in 1822, there's a ball in Buckingham Palace.
An agitation against the tax on imported corn was at its height. The Queen decided to hold a ball, pero la reina le da igual que haya recesión y que haya lo que haya. Entonces también es un momento de crítica y de no ver del todo bien.
So there is criticism. And this cultural movement was criticized because the middle-class bourgeoisie is trying to copy the lifestyle of the aristocrats, and there's criticism to this. And this is something that I explain in my thesis in a more elaborate way. But the European Romanticism and our Romanticism that is connected to the European Romanticism is not a working class Romanticism. Professor Borja Rodríguez Gutiérrez, when he studied Menéndez-Pelayo and the construction of Romanticism in an exercise of historic revision, points to certain inequalities in the concept of historical Romanticism as a created concept, because the middle class and lower classes are not represented in this Romanticism. So I have a question for you. What type of person was Lord Byron? What was Lord Byron's status? Was Espronceda a Byron hero? Do you know that this concept exists, a Byron hero? And it's applied for people who defend a series of values, a lifestyle. But we also see this in books. This Byron hero is used to refer to a lifestyle. So what does Menéndez-Pelayo says? Well, he says, aristocracy has an idea of Romanticism that is influenced heavily by English and German ideas. I'm not going to read Lamartine. So who represents 19th century poetry? In my view, it can be everyone or nobody. So I'm going to make another question. What type of social class does Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda belong to? Carolina Coronado and Fernán Caballero, what type of social class do they belong to? And there's a threefold consideration that we have here. We have to stop and think, because we have the relationship and the power that they have inherited, the relationship and the power that they have because of their marriages. In the case of Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, her marriage history was a catastrophe. There are works written about it. The three loves in her life, those love stories were terrible. But since these women were powerful and they were very clear about what they wanted, it was not well seen to marry them. Gertrudis has had very serious problems. Of course, they are powerful, they are wealthy, they have social connections. And what type of relationships do they foster throughout their lives? And they create different publications like Gaceta de las Mujeres, Álbum de las Manas, Hermandad Lírica, with Rosina Angudiana, Sade Merlar, and Carolina Coronado.
El semanario.
Now let's focus on Semanario Pintoresco Español from 1836 to 57, founded by Mesonero Romanos in a very smart way, because he used to say in the prologue in the first issue, I've seen in the UK, in England, there is a Spanish magazine, so I'm going to copy them. So he used the same font, the same types of contents, but I've seen the French inviting the big writers in his country, in their country, and that will make it smarter. So he mixes both models. He's changing the rules of editorial marketing by mixing the British and the French models in a Spanish magazine. This is what he says, and I quote, England, who leads the way in all useful applications, was also a pioneer in this type of things. The penny magazine, etc. The picturesque literary furor that took hold of the French people gave sufficient reason for those enterprises to be directed and cultivated by the most influential men and the most distinguished pens of the nation. And I have also included that in my thesis, in my dissertation. Bold, not cheesy. Bold was the work of our women writers, never cheesy. An epithet that has been used to undermine the work of our women writers. And I'm going to give you an example. Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda in 1841 published the first anti-slavery model, because she came from Cuba and she knew the reality. It is called SAP. This was published by the group of Cádiz. Well, it was found by the group of Cádiz, a research group that traces back all these origins. In Laureola, they said this is the Laureola magazine, and there is a subscription to the novel SAP. And they had many subscribers. So these were the writers, the female writers, and they were read. And then Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, because men at that time wrote poetry for women, but women didn't write that type of poetry. It wasn't only for men. In April 1836, when I started doing my research, I couldn't find any poems written by women. So a month later, I thought to myself, what am I doing wrong? It was one of those moments of despair when you work on your dissertation or your thesis. I was desperate, and then I found something. I found it on the 2nd February 1840. Carolina Coronado was the first woman to publish in that weekly magazine. What can I say about her? Well, she doesn't write a poem to her friend. No, she works on meditation about her own existence. That is, I think, a paradigm. Another important example that I wanted to mention is one by Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, the only one that in the Semanario Pintoresco Español wrote a poem to a man, one of her pretenders, Pedro Sabater, who later became her husband. It was something like, I don't want you to praise me because I don't need to be praised by anybody. I don't want to be rude, at least publicly. So she said, in your genius, yeah, not in the matter, you find such ideal features that only the sky grants to thought, to engender in its night such beauties. Love me well, pity me, and that's enough. And she writes that publicly and autographs it. And I'm going to mention a last example to show that they are first-line writers. Carolina Coronado read Sappho and read about Saint Teresa of Avila. This is like ironic mix of things. So she wrote an essay divided in two parts in Seminario Pintoresco Español, and she's like she's praising Saint Teresa of Avila in a unique essay, and she wrote about Sappho. Saint Teresa was missing freedom because she was living in a monastery, and she had to be subjected to the orders of the commands of the male friars. And Sappho, many women criticized Sappho, and ridicule and slander. They armed against Sappho, ridicule and slander. So she felt criticized by other women because of her position, because she was in the middle of those literary circles, in the Liceo, etc. And what about Mother Teresa? If that heroic woman had directed her energetic instinct towards the education of families, if she had directed the word of perfection to another perfection, not of the nuns but of the mothers, if it have brought forth an enlightened generation instead of tying up with the heart of virgins. I could say this today about myself in similar situations. So, do you think so? Do you think I could do the same now? They were perfectly free. So Romanticism was not only about Rosalia or sadness. No, it was a show that was center stage, and they could say whatever they wanted to. She criticized Saint Teresa of Avila because she's talking about her subjective intimism. What about the Baroque? In the Baroque, there was a hierarchy, even a slave dependency. It was a totally different relationship with religion, but she's in the 19th century. There's another example that I'm not going to mention because I don't have the time, about the uniqueness of that era. She said, I'm going to create with Fernández de los Ríos a character, Madame Richard. And she said, who was Madame Richard? It is a defect of Spaniards not to speak justly of foreigners. She's quoting, and then she starts criticizing. France has an army of literary women, but if any French poetess can be compared with Sappho, it's only George Sand. Oh, she's quoting.
Esto hicieron los ingenios españoles. Por lo que hace a las españolas, no ambicionamos ejércitos de literatas. Nos basta con haber tenido una poetisa más inspirada que las francesas y que ésta haya sido santa. Es increíble como ensayística.
End of quote. You have to read the female authors of the 19th century or another poem, Freedom. The speaker is quoting.
No hay nación para este sexo. 1846. Lo femenino.
1846. So imagine Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, Carolina Coronado, publishing all this in Seminario Pintoresco Español, and in parallel, men are criticizing women and defenestrating the image. The female writers were building about themselves. So the image of this weekly magazine, and this is similar to what is going on in French and England, and at least in the weeklies I've used for my research, is not a block, it's not a monolithic image. Men are trying to undermine how they were, even physiologically speaking, their psychological traits. And they, on the other hand, are trying to defend themselves. So depending on the director of the weekly, there will be the opinions will go to one side or the other. Some of them are misogynists, etc. For example, they even say, they get an excerpt of the one of George Sand's works and say, oh, too many objectives. But if Dumas or Balzac did the same, nobody said anything about them. So there was men and women on the other side. There was that division. And some women writers, as you know, needed to find a penman. Cecilia Boy de Favre, for example, who used Fernán Cabello. She had a very interesting family, and she was a rebel to her family. I'm not as feminist as my other colleagues, but I still defend her. So the masculine world served as a grounds for discussion for many of them. For example, Emilia Pardo Bazán, she was not the first to publish things about flamenco or folklore, because in the weekly magazine, one of the female writers, Amelia Corradi from Cádiz, wrote about the bride and groom of Sanlúcar, way before Fernán Caballero. So as I progress in my research, I find more and more female writers, and maybe there will be more. But we cannot say with certainty. The masculine model, using a male pen name, such as Fernán Caballero, was also criticized for Emilia Pardo Bazán. So this is the articulation of the idea of the male domains in the public sphere, and I will give you some examples now of the fact that men used to attack them. There's an issue in 1843 of the Seminario Pintoresco Español. His title was Women. It was anonymous, and they wanted to talk about us as gender. It was important because there was a paratext from La Entretenida de Cervantes. Women has to be good and have to look good. And she's quoting Miguel de Cervantes, La Entretenida de Miguel de Cervantes. End of quote. This accounts for 80% of what I found. And my reflection is I was overwhelmed. I was really touched and fed up and sick of it all. But, well, what about them? Because there were many drivers and factors revolving around them, and one has to think about it. Scorn and jokes made by the male writers to make fun of them. The magazine that interests me the most, or several magazines in France that will be influential for El Semanario, are Le Musée des Familles in 1833. And I will be going back to a concept that we could find in the Sappho text Carolina Coronado, regenerating Spain. This is very important in the 20th century. And family, again, nation, family, the regeneration of Spain. Those concepts after 1898 will be used in many political and press texts for the history of Spain, because in history of feminism, the regeneration of Spain passes through the role of women, and women were an issue, were a problem. If Spain is regenerated, what about them? No, they have to stay at home, because everything revolves around the role of family and children and the stay-at-home wives. Some magazines and some newspapers that I have used in France are Le Musée de Famille, La Belle Assemblée, and in England the Illustration, the Penny Magazine, the London Magazine, the Penny Magazine. The speaker corrects herself. And in parallel, from a methodological point of view, all these newspapers that I found in the archives and in correspondence from Mónica Burguera, Mercedes Comella, Mónica Kirkpatrick, the Countess of Campanangel, have been useful for me to find all the examples and the importance of using newspapers. In the British newspaper archive, that has open access, has collected all newspapers published in the UK, more than 12,000 issues from 1750 to 1799, and from 1850 to 1899, 2,638,376 issues, from 60,000 to 2 million. To decline again after 1950, 736,000, and from 2000 to 2023, 11,600 issues. And in the future, maybe just holograms. Susan Kirkpatrick, that I have just mentioned, in Women, Writers and Subscriptivity in Spain, her work said about Carmen de Burgos and the hinge writers between the 19th and the 20th centuries. So Carmen de Burgos, even if she identified herself with the common writers, launched a bold idea that women are, by virtue of their identity, their feminine identity, clear subjects. That is the origin of her work. And then the London Magazine published and publicly attacked female writers to deconstruct the feminine identity by attacking the French female writers in a series of publications from the 1760. Absurd dedication on female leaders, a word of advice to leaders in the legacy of the French ladies. End of quote. Sometimes they are idiots. They talked about the bidet. It wasn't politically correct at the end of the 18th century. They shouldn't have been talking about bidets or using bidets, because misogynism sometimes mixes with homophobic reasons and with some hints of nationalism. In my dissertation, I will be talking about two women. I would just mention them, Dorothy Nani and Adelaide Fontaine, whose books have been left in the attics for a long time. That attic and that legacy they wrote was very important in the post-war eras for the Lieu de Mémoire, and they talked about the ordeals and the difficult situations they had to face and the loneliness. Dorothy Celestia, one of them, even dared to translate Pico de Voltaire's poem, Tancred. She dared to use this epic genre and to change the female main character and to transform him into a woman. It has never been edited or published, but it's a beautiful poem. So she changed the space occupied by women in literary criticism and started to use it in epic publications. A female bard, far from an active land. That is the first verse of that poem, and well, she created an empire at the end of the poem. And very briefly, I'm going to link all this with the cultural roots because I've got a lot of information. 90% of the information about newspapers is about Europe and monuments, so I found lots of interesting things. So I needed to mention it here. That regard towards Europe will be changing at the end of the century. I found new newspapers, Revista Europea or European newspapers, but also Iberian Ilustración Ibérica, produced or led, directed by Ramon Olinas from Catalonia, and it was translated into Spanish and Portuguese, or Ilustración Española y América, or El Álbum Americano, by Concepción Jiménez de Flaquer. Now France and England were sent to oblivion, and now the Spanish press began to look at America. So at the beginning of the 20th century, in the political turmoil, there is some desire to look into our inner selves. That was also supported by Marcelino Fernández-Pelayo and Juan Valera, who in 1861 wrote an essay called Spain and Portugal. Nova Spain was at the head of Europe, and Portugal was the base of our head. End of quotes. And then he wrote about the Lusíadas by Camões, and she quotes. And I'm talking about Juan Valera now because he will be one of the pioneers in writing in a paper called Mysticism in Spanish Poetry, the speech on the ceremony of prize by Menéndez Fernández Pelayo, who talked about Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda and Carolina Coronado. But instead of looking at the French literary writers or the English literary writers, he began to look at the Spanish writers. That Iberism did exist already in the 19th century, and Louis Philippe in the Louvre defended it because he created a Spanish museum from 1838 to 1848 in order to showcase the Spanish heritage in the Louvre. Behind there was some political interests, but he was reigniting interest on Spain, and many French poets wrote their accounts on their travels through Spain. For example, Théophile Gautier from 1845 to 1849, and Alexander Dumas, or a chart. So this was all reunited or put together in a text, a letter to Carolina Coronado, in this reference to Iberism, by Ramón de Navarrete, who teases her by saying, "My friend, what are you looking for? Why are you missing Madrid and the riverbanks in the Guadiana?" Well, she's quoting.
Prosaico, según lo prueba hasta el oso y la encina de sus armas. Como diciéndole a Carolina que se ha ido a la corte y por qué no se ha quedado aquí en Almendralejo.
So he was asking her, why didn't you stay in Almendralejo? Why were you looking for in Madrid? He dared to do that, and in the same letter, he said that maybe she was fed up with the foreigners and she was going to Madrid because of the court and maybe the bullfighting. This is a parody of the stages of our civilization. He's referring to Alexander Dumas, etc. At the same time, Spain was the exotic woman for many French writers and for writers in other countries. And there is a quote, "Africa begins in the Pyrenees," that was attributed to Alexander Dumas, but it isn't clear anymore. It's the contrast between the absolutist Spain in the 19th century and the more liberal France of the same time. This is a sentence that is reverted by Miguel de Unamuno in his setting sobre la independencia patria. We will say Europe starts in the Pyrenees. All these ideas, and I go back to my initial reflection about industrialization and the role of women and the cultural turmoil. This is complicated. The handling of all of this is complicated, but this is a historical moment that makes this possible for them to be on the front line. So we say goodbye to Carmen by Mérimée and Georges Bizet and the Iberonism, and then after 1898 there is a new discussion in the last years of the 19th century, after the role of France and in other countries of Europe, who used to say Spain is a problem, especially after 1898 with the ideas of radiorationism. And I have a quote by Kirkpatrick and a reflection. She says that the Civil War, the outbreak of the Civil War just 5 years after the creation of the Republic, who was perceived by women as a symbol of modernism, really destroyed all the projects and ambitions that the men and the women who lived in the 19th century had been aspiring at. So I think it is necessary for us to revisit the canons, and as Emilia said, once I was watching her documentaries, if you feel desperate, if you feel in despair or in dismay, go back to history or listen or read my poem, awarded, you got the Carmen Conde Award. Sorry, it's a poem. I'm not translating it, but you can read the original. Thank you. And I finish by saying that I have a special affection for this experience I have lived here with you. And this is also a quote by El Cantar de los Cantares, and the voice of all these women cannot be my silence or your silence. Thank you.
Sí, Rosa.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. First, for the beautiful and kind words that you dedicated me at the beginning of your presentation, and for dedicating me the presentation. Your presentation was really brilliant, and it's incredible how you come here without images and you just come with your words, because words suffice. I'm going to make a few very small remarks aimed at improving your extraordinary work, and probably in your written work you have mentions of this, but I think in my opinion it would be very interesting to highlight how the Spanish press didn't imitate foreign press, but rather reflecting the 19th century reality. So these newspapers are tried to giving a response to readers that are looking for specific things. There are many 18th and 19th century newspapers before the War of Independence. We have El Sol, and we have the newspapers in Madrid, Cádiz, Mexico, and there were so many subscriptions to these 18th century writers. And regardless of whether the writers are men or women, it doesn't really matter, because if Cienfuegos was a man that wrote as a woman, that was because there was a demand. There were many women that wanted to read women writers. We have Rosa Galvez, who's the author of that book about Sappho, the first period romantic writer that we have. Okay, so we have all these 18th century press where the voice of women is very important also as receivers, as readers. I want to make a remark, I know you're aware of this. That word that you used, that lyrical aspects, is not something that Manzano Garias created as something poetic. Carolina Coronado herself had coined that term, and she didn't call it like that. She called it the emerging society of women poets, which is more powerful than the term used by Fernando Garias. She was talking about an association. What she was saying is, united, we'll be stronger than if we are by ourselves. And she published that in El Pensamiento, in a tribute that she pays to a deceased a female poet. I want to recommend you to read, if you haven't done it yet, to read in the newspaper El Reflejo an article published on April 27, 1823, entitled The Woman. It's the bravest article. It is signed by a woman. It's an anonymous article, but signed by a woman. There were attempts to identify it with Colladi, but there are no grants to do so. I really recommend you to read it. Indeed, as you were saying, she was invited to the inauguration of that train to Aranjuez. And not only she rode that train 2 days after, because she lost the train on the first day, she was also invited on this day that the Queen was there, where the most important women, or the most outstanding women in society, were present. So that, I just want to emphasize what you were doing. And the wagon was called Hernán Cortés. It was called Hernán Cortés. Some had a name and some didn't, and there was a wagon or a car called Hernán Cortés. One of the cars was called Hernán Cortés. So it came. A car with the name of Hernán Cortés was there to the rescue. So, and she was saying that since he had been humiliated, he came late to the rescue. She's so ironic. When I don't want to take too much time, but you were using a word that controls how women write, and it's a passion, that is fear. Why fear? Well, it's very simple. There's this feeling that is now referred to as harassment, but at that time we're talking an absolute harassment. That's what women writers felt. In the prologue of the publication of the poems by Gertrudis Avellaneda, it said very clearly, why are there such few women who are publishing in Spain regardless of writing really well? Well, because they're all afraid. Because men like cultivated women, they like writers, but they don't want to marry them. It's a society where women don't have rights, and the liberal government was promoting women distancing from convents. So what could women do if men rejected them? And this is very important. We have to take this into consideration. So, and we also must note that she really admired Saint Teresa. And she wrote in the newspaper Basilica Teresiana. But what she's doing is assuming that liberal thought. Teresa, if you had raised women to be mothers and to give children to the land, we are both fascinated by los genios gemelos, the twin geniuses. But what she proposes is something that's even riskier. She's promoting the model of a single woman who doesn't need a man and who can make her own living. So what happened? the most conservative press, like La Esperanza or Cecilia Folde-Faber, that was very excited with this scandal caused by the twin geniuses. What happened? Well, they all criticized Lee fiercely. So as a response to all of this, they invented this fake French woman, because Neira de Mosquera had attacked Carolina Coronado in a terrible way. She insulted her terribly, and there was nothing worse for a woman in those times to be called a political or smart aleck, because she was attacked and accused of being something that was considered terrible in those times. So one thing is writing, and another thing was being insulted in such a way. Medical treatises in those times refer that all diseases are for normal citizens. And for example, Campuron, the treaty of hysteria, history, nymphomania, lack of menstruation, all female diseases happened in women who were illustrated, women who were knowledged, and mostly who were writers. That's what medical treatises of the times said. So these scientific texts were very popular. So what men did was censor this type of women, even from the viewpoint of science. They would produce scientific documents. I also want to say that the attack that she suffered after writing The Twin Geniuses, or after she wrote La Sigea, are due to the liberal conception. She can stand Philip II because she was a progressive liberal, and she is against that. Philip II is going to be a monster also in her works. And I must let others speak. So to wrap up, when she talks about Iberism or Iberian Union, in addition to the fact that she was the first journalist in Spain, by herself, with her friends, without her family and her friends, she traveled to London by herself, I insist, to be a journalist in the London Universal Exposition. She was the first creator of the first bilingual magazine in Spain, El Frontero. It was published in Portuguese and in Badajoz, and it was published with the father of the Celtism school of thought. And this review was published together with Portuguese writers. She was convinced that there's a line separating two peoples that should be united. So the analysis that you did of the press in Europe is very accurate, and I want to encourage you to keep researching. And I do agree that the image of the lady is indeed destroyed and gives rise to the image of the writer, a writer who wants to make a living by herself, and she was able to do this. And Neira de Mosquera was right when she said that things changed when women got married, because they were afraid of their children suffering hostilities. Thank you very much, and congratulations. Thank you very much, Professor Fernández-Daza. Do you want to add anything, or should we move directly to the questions? Thank you very much, Carmen. I could listen to you non-stop. To talk, talking about the romantic writers. Thank you very much. Paula, please go ahead. First, I would like to congratulate you, Estefania. We have talked about this. I was very much looking forward to listening to you. And it's true, you didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation. You were the only one to not do it. And in line with what Professor Carmen was saying, there's a quote that I really like, that it says that brushes paint the body, but pens can create portraits of the soul. And often words are the best tool because images sometimes are not that relevant. I think your studies are fundamental. What you're studying is beautiful. Sometimes it can be frustrating because archive work can be frustrating. And I think delving into letter exchanges helps us to understand more than what we can grasp in literary works. You focus more on French and British authors, but I think in Spain we have the case of Pardo Bazán. And I wanted to repeat some quotes between the exchanges between Pardo Bazán and Pérez Galdós, which is an example of this fear, because sometimes this fear came from men. Men were afraid of women. Pardo Bazán wanted to join the academy, the Spanish language academy, 3 times, and she wasn't able to do it. Pérez Galdós and Pardo Bazán were lovers, and if they had lived nowadays, I'm sure that they would be in the gossip programs on TV all the time. In one of these letters between Bazán and Galdós, she says, how are my verses? And not even with that, they will make me a member of the academy. Part of the letters from Galdós has been lost, but we have the letters between Galdós and Clarín, and they do talk about her. And in those letters, he says something that is an example of what you're saying. I have just read a few chapters of Cisne by Emilia. I really liked what she wrote. The only inconvenience that she has is that she's a woman and that she loses her charm because of all this knowledge. I'm sure he didn't tell her that, and I'm sure, well, when he wrote to her, he told her things that were quite different, but we see how there were different things that came into play, and I think it's very important to highlight, as you're doing, the role of those women, of these free women that were able to do things in their times that can astonish us nowadays. They were pioneers. I'm thinking about Madame de Sauvigny in France, who's the mother of that letters, this genre of letters. And when in your presentation, we could see your love for what you're doing and your love for the literature that we all enjoy so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paula. I think Professor Freixas wanted to add something. I want to congratulate you because your presentation was very suggestive and very attractive. You touched upon topics that I was familiar with and some others that I wasn't familiar with. But I want to ask something. You didn't mention anything about the political context. Did you do that on purpose? But when we talk about the romantic writers who were men, we know what they were involved in, which often explains their letters or their works. But I didn't see that in your presentation. Maybe the political context. I mean, why? In the beginning, they were all members of the bourgeoisie, and that changed at the end of the 19th century. But in the beginning, they were all very bourgeois. At the end of the 18th century, the first one who dared say anything, Olympia de Gouges, she was beheaded. Robespierre had her beheaded. But even the liberals in Cádiz, they had their own literary workshops, the liberal writers in Cádiz. They had their workshops. They were very complex women from that perspective. And then we have the suffragettes. Suffragettes wrote their own books that were not as intimate, but they were writing indeed. Is there an underlying will in your presentation when you decide not to talk about the political framework or context? Because I think the political context forces your position. That is something that I found surprising. And congratulations, because I was very interested in your presentation. Thank you very much. Now Professor Baigorri has the floor.
So as to give some relief to the interpreters. I will tell at the end why. I recommend you to read a couple of books, which you may know perhaps. Portrait de traductrices, portraits of translators, female translators actually, edited by Jean Delisle. There is a collection of 11 articles, 11 pieces of research, where you will find some interesting translators, such as the youngest daughter of Karl Marx, Eleanor Marx, who was the first translator into English of Madame Bovary. So the first readers in English of Madame Bovary did it through the translation made by Karl Marx's daughter. Or Oscar Wilde's mother, who translated Lamartine and other French authors, and who contributed doing that. I beg your pardon. By doing that, she contributed to the Irish nationalist movement. She was called Jane Francesca L.G., but she wrote under an anonymous, I mean, she didn't sign the translation actually, which was a way to have a voice playing the trick of not showing who they were, for many reasons, not just for being female and not male, but also for political reasons, for censorship, etc., etc. Those are some of the pieces of literature, I mean literary literature that you will find in that book. And there is another equivalent book, which this perhaps you know in Spanish, Retratos de Traductoras en la Edad de Plata, Portraits of Female Translators in the Silver Age, edited by Dolores Romero Lopez, where you will find references. Again, it's an edited book where several contributions deal with Carmen de Burgos, María Martínez Sierra, María de Maeztu, Zenobia Campurbí, etc., etc., names that are very well known to you and that are, as you said, hinge, talking of Carmen de Burgos, for instance, hinge authors between the 19th and the 20th century. 19th century is your area or your field of interest. And then I finish with I would say with a piece of education regarding the use of rhetoric when we speak orally. I mean, Paula was saying that you are the only one that didn't show on a screen anything. You read at lightning speed. Read, I mean, basically didn't read, but I mean, it was like reading at lightning speed, using quotations of poetry. That is not included in the job description of a simultaneous interpreter. And you have to think, when you listen to yourself, the recording of this, try simply to do this. Shadow yourself. Say the same, at the same time, overlapping yourself in Spanish, and then think what it means to put that in another language. Simply that. So, other than that, I mean, it is very well done, of course, research, very dense, full of erudition, etc. But I mean, this is simply an issue that I wanted to point out because I think it's worth also to teach you how to approach something when there is interpreting into another language. and in other languages too. And I say this because I've been a victim of that many times. I've interpreted around 2,000, approximately 2,000 meetings in my career, approximately. And on occasions, I couldn't believe that what I was doing, which, for instance, for me, translating from French into Spanish was quite easy because, in a sense, I could follow the author with the same grammar, basically. But I thought sometimes of how that could be put into Russian, into Chinese, into Arabic at the UN, with concepts and with grammars which are totally different. So this is a piece of advice in general. Don't take it as a hard criticism, simply as a lesson, if you wish. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Baigorri.
Thank you very much, Professor Baigorri. Natalia Armijos, you have the floor. Thank you, Miguel Ángel. I wish to congratulate you. I loved your presentation. It's really necessary to hear about this type of research, and it's time to disseminate this type of research, and it's time for us to go back in history and to rescue all these valuable women that were very at the forefront for a long time, and that were very committed. Some of them were incredibly brave, had no fear, and it has always been, things have always been tough for women and still are. So this type of research is really important for reference for girls and young women nowadays to have reference, because we keep hearing this idea of regeneration. We keep going back to these cycles, these regrettable cycles of wanting to take control of women, and they want to guide us and impose moral and family to us, and they want to impose on us certain values closer to certain ideologies. So I think that your exhibition, your presentation was really brilliant, and I really hope that we keep receiving presentations on this topic and about the contributions of women on sciences and other environments and other aspects. In the Council of Europe, one of the last itineraries that was certified by the Council of Europe was an itinerary of women writers. I met some of the organizers of the routes, and unfortunately, the initiative was in Slavic countries, Montenegro and other Slavic-speaking countries. It includes 19th-century women writers. And I was saying, you have to include Rosalía de Castro. You have to write the Rosalía de Castro Foundation. And we have Fernando Cabello, and we have other French writers. I think this fear that men have of cultivated women is not new. We see it in the Spanish classical literature. There's a work that you all know, La Dama Boba, the Silly Lady. There are two sisters. One is more cultivated. And then we have L'Enfant Savant by Molière that ridicules women. And in both cases, we have the topic of marriage and love. And both writers, Molière and López de Vega, always prioritize love and marriage to what they consider something that is almost like a perversion. These women these older women, like for example the one who gets married in L'Enfant Savant, then in that work we have this man who wants to seduce them, and in the literature in that times the award was always marriage. That was the retribution for everything marriage. So this fear to cultivated women, it's not a modern one. It's been there for 3 centuries. Thank you very much, Estefania, for your presentation. I don't know anything about this topic, but it was a great pleasure to hear you. And I really admire you and admire your work. So I'll include your poetry books in my to-read list. I was remembering a letter that Manolita Saez was an Ecuadorian politician and who was a lover of Simón Bolívar. She was one of the leaders of the revolution, and she married an Englishman called Jamestown, and she wrote him a letter called 1000 Times No in 1824. And I'm going to read why she leaves him. She says, "My Lord, you are excellent. You are impossible to imitate. By my friend, I'm going to leave you for Bolívar. Leaving a husband wouldn't have any merit if you do it for any other. I know that I cannot join him through the laws of honor, as you refer to them, but do you think I feel less honored because I'm her lover and not her wife?" And then she explains why she's leaving her husband. It's all very British, because monotony is reserved to your nation. You walk without any hurry, and you don't laugh even at your own jokes. Those are divine attributes, but I am miserable mortal. I can laugh at myself, and I laugh at you because of your British seriousness. And she says, "Well, I'm going to suffer a lot in heaven." And then she says, "You are a Catholic. I am an atheist. And these are great religious obstacles. I love someone else, and this is the strongest and highest reason." Thank you very much, Camilo. It's all very clear. Before giving Andrea the floor, I wanted to mention something. I really liked your presentation, particularly because you made it clear that, well, there are a couple of presentations that kind of like diverge from the general context of the courses, but I thought they were very necessary because you present the perspective that is often underlooked, which is part of our history, of our common history, and it's part of our common heritage. You help us see that we have a biased vision of history. Many of the names that you mentioned, I had never heard about, and I found that painful, whereas I was familiar with all the names of men that you mentioned, and I found that worrying. I found it worrying how ignorant of history I am. So I think your presentation really makes sense in this context, because it's part of this heritage. Because these women contributed to these common values, these European values. And European values are incomplete if we do not include these women's contribution to history. So this type of work helps us be more familiar to this part of history that is forgotten. And then I have a reflection, because some of the analysis, and we saw that in this last presentation, we hear a lot about letters. In letters, we have the opinions that people have about others, and this really helps us understand the society of those times. And if I bring this idea to the current situation, right now we communicate through emails, tweets, and there's a lack of archives. There's no conservation of these exchanges. Much of these will be lost because hard disks break down, cell phones are lost. So it's really important that this heritage has been preserved, and some people are studying them. So what will happen with today's society? Much of these exchanges will be lost, and we won't be able to let this go down in history. First, I'm going to congratulate you, and I want to answer that question that you made in the beginning. How do we imagine women? Because in connection with what Miguel was saying, we all have our own bias. I was not familiar with most of the names that you mentioned. For me, it's a challenge to read this. I have read some of the things, but very few. But when you said, what is the image that we have of 19th century women? I want to share mine. The country where I come from, in my country, the image of women is that of Queen Mary of Romania, who was a politician, an author, a diplomat, a nurse, the mother of the injured in 19th century, in the First World War. She was known as the King of Romania. Her husband let her go to Paris to look for the unification of the country, a country that is just 105 years old. The mother of 5 children, and the first one in the battlefield in First World War, and who's the mother of all Romanian attempts to be part of international organizations like the UN. And her predecessor was Isabel de Veil, who's a poet, like you are. And what I can tell you about Mary of Romania is the image of a queen, a British queen who was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, dressed up as a shepherd, the national costume of Romania. I hope it can be useful for you at any moment.
Gracias, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea. I think everything that has been said is a praise for your expose, and well, the rest is composed of ideas and recommendations, such as the one given to you by Professor Baigorri, because it is true that if you want interpreters to be able to convey your message, you have to take that into account. Thank you, Estefania, for your hard work and your expose, and a big applause for them.